Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Unfortunately, I'm not 100% at the moment. I'm sort of fighting off a cold, and hopefully my voice will last the next hour and a bit. And if it doesn't, then you get to enjoy a shorter session this afternoon. So, first thing, my true expertise is on the technical side of housing. I do assist 10 First Nations, currently now 9, with housing management on a very small scale compared to the technical side of it. By technical, I mean the construction, renovation, and management of those type of projects. But I do get to see from time to time, or get to sit down with housing managers, chief and councils, and those type of individuals in my communities to help them shape or develop, change their housing management practices or strategies. So in 10 years, I've seen quite a bit, and I'm still continuing to see the evolution of it. Back when I first started, it seemed to be more of a style where it was very, what do they call it? After the fact, stuff would happen and then I'd get called in to help troubleshoot something. Now I'm seeing a lot of my larger First Nations doing more proactive stuff. So they're starting to plan sort of end of the calendar year in anticipation of what's going to happen for 6-7 months down the road, which again, I find great examples of, again, leadership. So the one thing I do want to make clear is that I'm not here to tell you how to manage housing. I'm sort of here to help you, or maybe provide examples and strategies of what I've seen with my communities in the last 10 years. So if it sounds like I'm preaching, hopefully it's not coming off that way. So when I get a chance to, again, meet with chief and councils, housing managers, this is what I try to make them focus on as an end goal, no matter what they're trying to achieve. Renovations, new construction, policies, or anything like that. The end goal for me is always trying to be safe and healthy homes within our communities. How that happens or how that goes about for my 9 to 10 communities is very individualistic. They all have their own personalities, their own strengths, their own weaknesses. And we try to combine those and take advantage of them as best we can. So the next challenge is when we sit down and talk about housing management. This is basically the small list of organizations and resources available to my First Nations. And we're going to go through the pros and cons sort of each of these. Man, I don't know if I'm going to make it an hour. I really apologize, but it is what it is. Some communities like these organizations. Some are unaffiliated, and again, as tribal councils, they don't have those type of resources. But the biggest driving force I see for a lot of my communities and their direction towards housing as a whole is what they hear from their own membership, whether that's from community-wide meetings or however they gain information from their membership. It usually leads them in a direction towards, again, healthy and safe homes. The downside to this type of an approach is that you can't make everybody happy. You can't include everything under the sun to achieve this. When I see communities write massive housing policies or include really complex housing, or it seems to fail just about every time. They want to be inclusive of everything, but it's not specific enough to achieve their end goal. The inclusiveness of it works very well when it comes to the construction side and the renovation side, but the policy side, down the road, it leads to, again, a lot of failures. And I'm not saying like big failures, I mean little small things that are sort of the chinks that, again, you can't accomplish with individuals' needs. And I'm hoping that makes a little more sense. I briefly touched on, again, housing policy just a second ago. Making overly complex housing policies, including everything under the sun, can also be a good thing and a bad thing. Communities without housing policies can also be a good thing or a bad thing. Some of my communities have them, and they do really well with housing construction, renovation, management. And I have communities with very complex, where they've included all kinds of means of communicating and governance inside their housing policy. The chief and councils. Great big pro that I see with my chief and councils is that they know the big picture. They know all the little things going on in the community or with their staff or inside and out of the band office that a specific housing manager may not know. They make really, really good project managers, and we'll get into that a little later on. The downside with chief and council that I see is that the 2-year term thing kind of hurts them for long-term housing planning and management of that type of thing. Sometimes housing takes longer than their 2-year term. And that's the biggest downside I see of housing management and chief and councils. Also the pro, there seems to be chief and councils getting out of the housing management side once communities reach a certain size. They have the capacity to hire somebody, take on housing management, general contracting, all kinds of things, so that they can focus on more political matters or matters that are more concerned to them. The great thing about that is that, yes, they don't have that scope of work, but now you have a separate person who's now responsible for something that they may or may not have a huge amount of experience in. And what I mean by that is that what I typically see is housing managers without a huge set of skills as they come in to take on those roles and responsibilities that we'll get into. Tribal councils can be great and can be detrimental. Again, me being from a tribal council, we're really good at problem solving. We're technical people in technical departments, and we have lots of experience dealing with large number of communities in my case, or several of the communities that could apply to your community if we get to sit down and talk. So that relative experience can be carried over from community to community. The downside of tribal councils is that we're usually overloaded based on, again, the number of communities we assist or the roles and responsibilities that we're taking on. As I said in the beginning, I'm really good at the technical side of it. However, again, I find it really difficult to advise communities on the management side of it. So now everybody's favorite organization, Indigenous Services Canada. Just like with any other government service, they have their pros and cons. In my experience, they're very good at communication and explaining what their end goal is. Give you a set of funds to do something, and they say this is what we'd ideally like to see it accomplished for anything in housing. The downside that I see that they're getting better at is the flexibility with that. As many of you are aware, the whole housing funding back in 2016 under management capacity development was meant for, again, really good intentions, but had zero flexibility with it. And there were huge challenges with it. Some communities, again, didn't need housing management dollars, but they just needed a whole bunch of renovation dollars. So that couldn't be what the community needed. What we just saw last fiscal, or the current fiscal, is that, yeah, now they're amending core capital for housing. So there's no proposal-based funding type scenarios. The next one, this is the one I see the most issues with housing management, is Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. There's so many programs, so many pieces of paper, so many different deadlines. There's a lot of ins and outs of it, and some of it is very gray. And what I mean by gray is that they have a set of rules that they'll tell you that they need, but there's a bit of flexibility in it that you don't really get until you know how the program works. So what I mean by that is there are gray areas with the renovation program with CMHC, RAP. There are things you can do and there are things you can't do. And again, when you talk to a representative from CMHC, they'll tell you what you can and you can't do. But when you talk to a tribal council or somebody who's been doing RAP for 10, 12 years, well, those things are actually gray. You might be able to do it, just depends on how far you want to stretch the line. And I've seen them happen over the years, and it's, at the end of the day, it's to the benefit of the community. Just whether or not you're willing to go that far with it. I can't give specific examples, but I wish I could. But there are means to getting more out of CMHC's programs. There's also a lot of parties involved with CMHC Section 95, those type of things. Again, outside inspection services that you have to coordinate, knowing how mortgages and lenders and ministerial loan guarantees, all of that type of programs, which again, can be a heavy burden on housing management. This one I've only seen with a couple of my communities is where they take their core capital and they'll go to a bank and use it as collateral for a loan. So they'll say we receive X number of dollars for the next 5 years. This is how we'll pay back this loan to do, say, 10 to 20 homes in 1 year. And then they'll just pay it off over the next 5 years. Lenders are more willing to do that nowadays. But again, there's also things that they're very, very rigid on. Again, payment schedules and total loan values and fluctuating interest rates and all those things over the length of the loan that go into, again, larger housing projects and larger renovation projects. General contractors, I have sort of two definitions for it. There's general contractors that I work with and help communities work with that are within their own communities or surrounding communities in my case, or communities that are, say, from outside of their communities, from near municipalities, say like general contractor for Thunder Bay working in Fort William, as an example. They're very good at organizing communication and getting something done at their best, at their best interests at heart, because they're a business. They need to make profit, and when communication or lack of communication breaks down is usually when general contractors and housing management sort of goes awry that I've seen in the past. The other thing that can happen is the lack of upfront work to plan what the total agreement between the two parties are usually. Usually it's a party between, an agreement between the band and a general contractor to do something. It could even be, again, a housing policy or renovations or construction. The next one, local contractors are absolutely needed, in my opinion, within your communities to build up that base and to keep as much of your housing dollars within the community. I'm all for hiring general contractors, but still keeping 60-70% local labor. That's what I try to advise communities on, but there are sometimes instances where that's just not possible. And it's the band, housing management, chief and councils need to make that decision what's best. Local labor seems to be a hit or miss in a lot of my communities. They can be really, really, really good, and they can also be really, really bad attendance-wise. They have a tendency to sometimes make their own schedules if they don't know what's needed up front or what they don't know if they're agreeing to up front, those type of things. Suppliers, again, have basically their best interest at heart, being a business. I try to advise communities to get away from dealing with suppliers on their own, but again, there are instances where it's very positive or financially better to get supplies on your own versus going through a third party, like local labor or a general contractor. The downside to suppliers is usually when communication breaks down. If they're not kept in the loop, usually things get just further behind. And for my road access communities, it's the backlog can be pretty easy, like 1 or 2 weeks is nothing. But remotes in that, I can only imagine the amount of hours and time it takes to try and arrange contractors, labor, and all of that based on your limited schedule and season. Land management is something that only one of my communities deals with. And whether it's with your own local lands manager or even possibly Indigenous services. Indigenous service land management comes into play when you're getting into CP, certificate of possession, or private ownership on reserve. One of my communities does it, and they're doing it rather well, which I'll get into it later. But it's another department or portion of your housing management that usually comes from a housing policy. How lands, or whether it's for residential or commercial or resource development, those type of things. It's a smaller portion of what I see in housing management, but it's still there. Water and wastewater is a pretty obvious thing. Again, once we have something physical, it has to be connected to some sort of infrastructure. So usually liaising with local operators or tribal council, hub operators, water and wastewater specialists. It's usually pretty easy. It's along the same lines of how you would work with the tribal council. Again, advisory services or having local expertise as to where stuff is underground. Again, it's still a piece that a housing manager may not know off the top of their head. Health services is something I'm seeing, again, more and more going into the preliminary planning of housing, as well as into the specific job descriptions or services that housing management provides. Coordinating some things as simple as driving someone to an appointment in town in my case, or coordinating those type of services. We're seeing housing managers starting to coordinate construction and organization of treatment facilities as well. I'm seeing that more and more, as well as personally I'm assisting with a couple of those. So that's another thing that a housing manager has to deal with. The last two, the Elders and Housing Council, is kind of housing policy specific. One of my communities has an Elders Council that sits sort of at the same hierarchy as Chief and Council. So elders get advised at community-wide meetings on where housing will be going down the road, or which direction, or that type of advice. As an example, I, for the first time, got to sit down with this Elders Council, and I got to explain to them how Section 95 housing works, how it works over the length of the mortgage initially and all of that, because they then got to advise the Housing Council, in this case, that sat below them on the hierarchy in the community. So in that case, they kind of got first say. But they also had to work with the housing manager in this case as to how their Section 95 application was going to go in. Does anyone here have that type of scenario in their community where they have like an elders council or a housing council that sits somewhere in with chief and council? Yes? No? No hands. Okay, so there's an example of, yes, there's one community. I should see one hand. I see the, community that I'm talking about. He's here, but again, that was derived from a housing policy and that type of structure. Can anybody think of something that's not on this list or organization that a housing manager might have to deal with day to day, year to year? The only one else that I could think of is maybe subcontractors or subs, something like that. But I was also thinking that that could also be sort of the same boat as a local contractor. Yeah.
I don't know if you touched on it or not, but when you're speaking of Section 95, you came home.
Yeah.
You never mentioned tenant criteria and tenant selection.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I've done a few of these already. You talk about the Elders Council and the Housing Council. We tried it for our First Nation. And you get the elders in the Housing Council and members in that community. Almost 90% would drop out after a while because don't forget, they're the front lines that stand in front of the community to help them get a home. That's a real tough one.
Yeah. And yeah, it's, again, I see that. Yeah.
We're going to do it again, but this time we're taking the housing, we're going to call housing authority this time, and we're going to take everybody from different aspects of our community, elders, single families, and a lot of our, like our First Nation over the years have built a lot of low income homes with Section 95. We're going to try to get the homes down. We forgot about some of our elders, we forgot about some of our single adults. So that's your criteria. If you don't got your housing policy, it's not about 8%. You get our First Nation is back to 900, what do you do? 2,000 total.
Yeah.
And our list is about 250.
Yeah. So again, that ties in with, Section 95 housing policies, yeah. So let's get the obvious out of the way. Everybody's sort of seen this type of strategy when it comes to housing, whether it's renovation, construction, management. When I say housing, I'm just going to mean those three things altogether, no matter what, okay? The team approach, again, you sort of pick the best of this list to build a team to do something. And it's going to vary depending on what your end goal is. As an example, say you're going to build, I'm just going to sort of use this sort of new construction example throughout the rest of this, but from this list to build a new home, you probably going to need about 5 or 6 of these at least. So general contracting, suppliers, some sort of money from somewhere, ISK, CMHC, your own funds, and some sort of organization. So some sort of chief and council advisory or that type of thing, right? The key, or one of the keys to the team approach, is have all of your parties decide what their roles and responsibilities are up front. If you do it mid-project, or something's going to fall through the cracks, or if somebody bails on you, who's going to pick up the slack? Okay, so that's one of the big benefits of it. The next one is that you need an effective way to communicate amongst each other, whether it's email, phone, but again, talk to everybody up front and decide what you want to do. Whether email works, or again, some of my communities don't have access to good email for internet service, so again, that's kind of out for one of them. But again, everybody has to know that up front. And then the last thing, where again, it usually breaks down, is where either somebody leaves the team prematurely without anybody really knowing. They've just decided they don't have enough time to allocate towards this anymore, or even they've quit their position and you just don't know. And they had all this work to do and now they're gone. Now somebody has to pick up the slack. And so again, if they're left out of the loop, or if the information doesn't filter down to whomever it needs to get to, that's when things can sort of go sideways rather quickly. So here's one that got brought up at a discussion, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, at a chief and council meeting that I went to, that I really wanted to share with you guys. This is what they referred to as the subtractive method. And I don't even know if the title makes sense, but basically it boils down to taking this list and involving as little people as possible, or as little, you know what I mean? As little number of these organizations as possible. And let me give you an example. I have a community that deals specifically with lands management for all of their housing. And that's it. It's all private possession. So they have a housing policy that includes just that. So they don't deal with ISK housing, CMHC, finance banks, general contractors, locals, none of that. All they deal with is their membership and lands. Lands deals with the legal survey, and then from there, once a legal survey, it's all in the membership's hands. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are communities that have Indigenous services, their dollars allocated towards non-housing, whether it's water and wastewater or something. Every dollar from ISK doesn't go into housing. They strictly use their own source capital. So they keep ISK reporting out of the equation. They make it simpler that way. So those are two kind of examples. Another one that I try to advise communities on, or as an option, is especially for smaller communities, and in my case a smaller community is 30, maybe 40 homes, somewhere, 20 to 50 homes, that type of size of community, is to get out of general contracting themselves. What I mean by that is that in this case, a counselor typically, because they don't have the capacity for a housing manager, they're general contracting subs, local labor, suppliers, versus say hiring a general contractor, one person, to take care of all of that for themselves, where then they can then focus on their roles and responsibilities as a counselor. So that's another example. Sorry. Okay. I think I'm doing pretty well. Okay. Excuse me. Another example, and me being from a tribal council, I can say how complicated a tribal council can be to assist a community. Sometimes it's very simple, sometimes it's very not. And what we try to do is provide the best advice, and sometimes it's not advice, it's solutions. And that's where I see things going wrong. What I mean is that a community comes to the tribal council with an issue, and as technical advisors or engineers, they're there, they have that mindset of just giving you one answer. Here's your best solution. So then it's not really from within, versus going to a tribal council and asking for options. So I try to provide at least 2 to 3 options for whatever it is they're trying to solve. And they're all going to have pros and cons. There's never one right answer. Okay? So back to the simple solution. One thing that recently got proposed to the finance minister, the current finance minister, was, and I'd like some input on this from you guys if I could, is simplifying CMHC itself. ISC last fiscal went in the direction of just amending core capital for housing. So no proposals, no any of that. You just have one piece of paper due June 30th for the extra housing dollars that you had. And you got to do whatever the heck you wanted with it. Renovations, management, have people come to this conference, whatever. So long as you told them what you were going to do with it, you had free reign. So, Chief proposed to Finance Minister, why can't we do that with CMHC's dollars? And 4 years ago, it seemed like a very good thing. Because for my smaller communities, understanding Section 95, the ins and outs of Section 95, RAP, ERP, all those other programs is a lot of extra work if at the end of the day all you're doing is building and renovating homes. So I'm hoping down the road things will get much, much easier for housing managers. But again, there has to be the political will to say, go as far as removing CMHC's budget from the federal line and doing something as simple as amending a First Nations core capital. Because that amount of work for new counselors even, who've never been exposed to housing, or anybody new to housing, it's overwhelming. So any way that, again, I can see making this simpler would be beneficial to housing managers as a whole. Now, do you guys, as a show of hands, or does anybody have any thoughts on how housing management could be made easier in your own communities that I possibly haven't touched on. Again, even at a tribal council level, again, the extra work that I have to do for, again, inspection services, those dollars and time in that is not staying in my communities. So I think that's a detriment. Does anybody agree with me? Anybody know? Anybody think that's a really bad idea? Can anybody see any other scenarios to keeping this simple or to making this easier for those in the field that I may have not touched on? Those are the big ones. Try to get out of general contracting. The other one that I can kind of think of is if you don't have the current capacity to do it, don't do it. And what I mean is if you don't, if you don't have tenant selection criteria, it may not be wise to do Section 95 housing. Or if you don't have local labor to do a whole bunch of renovations, well, it may not be wise to apply for a whole bunch of RAP dollars. There's other things that you think are more important, try and focus on that, whether policy or water and wastewater infrastructure or whatever. That's what I mean by that. And one last thing I can think of and add to this list is training initiatives. There are several organizations out there that provide subsidized, unsubsidized training for housing managers, counselors, those type of things. That could be on this list. Does anybody have any questions before we go? Yes?
Does anybody have any questions for Chris Price? Any comments? Suggestions?
You're talking about general contractors, local contractors, and suppliers.
Yeah.
Fort William First Nation has the luxury of being close to City of Thunder Bay. So over the years I've been here, we built relationships with the suppliers. Sorry. The only thing I can tell everyone else, if you're going to build a major project, 10 units or 5 units or more, you got to plan well ahead for some of the supplies you're going to get. There's a lot of suppliers. Even Thunder Bay, they don't carry enough of them. We've got like probably over 50 flooring stores. We still can't get enough flooring to put, things like you do it now. So we don't do rugs so well. Those are one of the things you're going to have to look at. Is get ahead of the game and order your supplies up front. And if you're going to build a home, stick to one brand. Make it easy. Unless you let your members choose the flooring, you got to do that way in advance too. The general contractors is like to me is like a project manager. He's going to build all your units for you. He's going to supply all the contracting and subcontracting. Local contractors, I call them just our guys in our community who can build a home. And we've got 5 of them actually, 5 contractors in our community alone. So we're doing pretty good there. But it's like planning well ahead for your services and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So to go along with that, again, if you did, I don't know, say a project of 5 to 10 homes and you now know that you have issues getting materials for, say, 10 homes, right, over the course of a project. Well, maybe, again, just your surrounding suppliers aren't capable of doing 10 homes. In addition to,
There's 2 ways trial and error, you learn, right? So at the first time, he just hired the local contractors to do only training. He set the bar for rate, he did about $60 a square foot. I supplied all the material, and if you're gonna be a project manager on that, it's a headache, I'll tell you. You try to get everything delivered at once, but it's like being a project manager, so just a heads up, you gotta plan a lot into that. Or you can leave it up to the local contractors if they're good enough. Turnkey operation.
Yeah.
So you set up in your contract with the pay schedule, and that pay schedule, you get paid the workers and get your contract. That saves a lot of headache. You still gotta be a project manager.
Yeah, if your band office doesn't have the capacity to schedule subs and local labor and yeah. Supply issues. Yep. Yep.
Building a warehouse, the house, new supplies.
The only thing I can say is if you get something, so we did a subdivision, actually. Open units and those subdivisions. You could, if you want, you go far away, you know, it's same use of the building.
Yeah, I think it's not high supplies. Multiple units. You knew you're gonna build the same units. You just stockpile the supplies, but in order to do that, you have to build a warehouse, right? Because there's funding for that kind of stuff. Plan ahead.
You can't build a fence yard. Figure something on that?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I know a lot of communities are long ways away. 4 or 6 hour drive for delivery for something.
Yep.
Longer than that. Yeah, we're, we don't have to deliver next one of them, but I can see that, yeah, places like further out. East up is forward.
Any
Thank
other?
you. Is there any more questions, comment for Chris?
There's nothing else from anyone. Thank you very much. I'm just glad I made it through without losing my voice.
Okay, we have a few minutes. One more question. I thought I saw you put your hand up. Okay, on behalf of the Housing Conference Working Group, and thank you for your presentation, and here's a gift for you.
Thank you.
Miigwech.